Okay. As we gear up for the first of two panel discussions today, allow me to very quickly scope the problem. The building sector accounts for approximately 37% of global CO2 emissions, with ASEAN being one of the faster growing in the regions. Now, what we have also realized is that for the building sector, it starts from the design, where the embodied and operational carbon dioxide emissions matter the most. So some previous research has been performed for the residential sectors in Europe. And these are the numbers that you see on the screen in front of you. You would realize almost immediately how much of these would cost to actually retrofit existing buildings with greener technologies, amounting to from anywhere between 25 to 75% of their GDP, which is a significant amount of money. Now, what can be done? Here are a few identified existing solutions, and it starts at the very top, from design leadership, where there is a clear mandate from the senior leaders in an organization to set clear and achievable goals, to then moving down the supply chain to ensure that you procure and you use low carbon materials. Following that, you then have low emission construction, where the blocks are modularized and scalable so that you can transport them with ease to the site where it's eventually assembled. Now, once you have your building up, then how do you integrate, or how do the buildings coexist in a central cooling system design, where you can leverage on the effective cooling measures that are in place? Last but not least, and something that's equally significant, is of course retrofitting. And we see an increase in this one-stop shops in providing solutions to, or retrofitting solutions that allows you to reduce your operational carbon dioxide emissions through HVAC, which is your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, as well as your automation and control. A good example would be the lights that you now have in most toilets in Gaia, where they are controlled by the motion sensors. Now, these solutions aren't without some challenges or obstacles, and I would like to quickly highlight four. The first of which is economics. And as how Prof. Switzer alluded to earlier, it's about the money, correct? How do you finance this? So this incremental cost for retrofitting is not so palatable to some developers, and the cost passed through to the tenants is not well established. Next, you have, or rather the lack of actionable energy audits is something that has proved to be a key tool that can be used to drive change. The third is knowledge gaps. Perfect. So knowledge gaps, both from a management point of view in setting these clear goals that I spoke about earlier, as well as all the way down to the operationalization of these. So the skill sets for these workers to actually know how to integrate these new technologies into the existing technical know-how that they already have. And the last obstacle that we have identified is the readiness of the grid. Now, renewable energy operates very differently from most energy sources that we are now very used to in power generation, AC to DC. And this involves a significant investment in this infrastructure, and this is also something that is lacking in this region. However, like how Prof. Switzer again mentioned, there's always hope. So these are some recommendations that the panel will be speaking about later, but allow me to very quickly just touch them on what they are. So they cover things like your regulatory recommendations, your incentives, which include how you can support these new building materials, all the way to the compulsory energy audits that can drive and move change, focusing on poorer performing buildings to see how you can scope the problem and then provide viable solutions. Last but not least, I think what's very important is driving this partnership. I think a collaborative partnership between the landlords and the tenants is instrumental in moving the needle when it comes to decarbonizing the operational carbon for buildings. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the first panel on buildings, Mr. Timothy Goh from Decade. He will be joined by 4 esteemed panelists, Mr. Sam Nun, who is the Business Development Manager at Reset Carbon, Ms. Yvonne Huang, who is the lead representative in Asia for GRESB, Mr. Ho Chi Kit, who is the Senior Director and Chief Engineer at C&W Services, and last but not least, Prof. Tan Ming Chen, who is the Director at HP NTU Digital Manufacturing Joint Lab from the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Please put your hands together and give them a round of applause.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon and to be moderating this panel. I had a call with them yesterday and I'm really excited to kind of be involved and to share kind of their knowledge with you. I guess maybe I should do a quick introduction. My name is Timothy Goh. I'm a partner at Decarbonisation. I head up the sustainable finance practice. Questions? Okay. Yeah, sorry. And I'm going to introduce my panelists because you're not here to listen about me. Sam is one of the leads for the real estate practice at Reset Carbon, Asia's largest pure play decarbonization consultant. He has a background in construction and was formerly North Asia Head of Sustainability at Hilti Group. His key focus areas at Reset are embodied carbon reduction and tenant engagement. We also have Yvonne. Yvonne is the lead representative of GRESB in Asia. Her mandate is to encourage real estate and infrastructure companies in Asia to participate in the GRESB assessment. GRESB is an investor-led green scorecard provider that offers actionable ESG insights for institutional investors, banks, and corporates to aid their decision-making throughout the investment cycle. Yvonne is a seasoned company director with extensive board governance experience and formerly a director at Capital Land. She now holds multiple board positions in addition to a GRESB role. We also have Chikit. Chikit is a senior director at Cushman & Wakefield, leading the sustainability and net zero carbon assets technical consultancy in the Asia Pacific. He focuses on optimizing asset performance, reducing costs, and aligning carbon reduction target with corporate goals. With a strong background in engineering and sustainability, Chikit is also an educator and published author in various academic conferences. He holds advanced degrees and certifications in engineering and energy management and business continuity. And last but definitely not least, Prof. Tan. Prof. Tan is from the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, NTU. He was up to recently the Program Director of Building and Construction at the Singapore Center of 3D Printing, and currently the Director of the HP NTU Digital Manufacturing Corporate Lab. Since 2019, he has been on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Value Chains. He is listed as a global shaker for his pioneering work on concrete 3D printing. Could you bring back the recommendations? So I'm just going to bring it back to recommendations because I think we want to get the panelists' thoughts on each of the various recommendations. I think maybe I'll kind of start off with Sam. He wants to talk to us a little bit about the green leasing framework, kind of the landlord-tenant, not conflict, but the issues that arise from the recommendation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. So I think let's talk a bit about landlord-tenant engagement. I think if we look at the operational footprint of a building, particularly commercial building, you've got basically two buckets you can separate the emissions into, right? So you've got what comes from the shared services, which is your elevators, your HVAC. You've got then everything that is actually under control of the tenants. So that can be things like lighting and basically if they've got individual heating, cooling, refrigeration in their sites. Now, one of the big challenges that a lot of people are finding in the industry is that there's a bit of a miscommunication right now between if you're a tenant, how do you start to talk to your landlord about sustainability initiatives? If you're a landlord, how do you actually get your tenants involved to help you to reach your carbon target? So there's a couple of issues that are big ones at the moment in the industry. I'll talk about those, the issues first. I think the first is that people are struggling to actually talk to the right people. They're struggling to find the right contact. So if you're a landlord, you want to talk to your tenant, typically you only know the person who's responsible for that lease. And actually the same thing happens if you're a tenant, you know the leasing team at the landlord, and quite honestly, you're normally in a pretty adversarial relationship because you're trying to get as much rent out of them as you can. So that's obviously not something that's really conducive to sustainability. So what we see in the rest of the world that is really now a new working model is the green leasing model. And there's been an attempt to do that in Asia. A lot of developers have now got green lease programs, but they're still not working perfectly because there's still a fundamental disconnect that the wrong people are talking to each other. So if we look in Asia, the first thing to do on tenant engagement is make sure that the sustainability teams are involved with the leasing discussions, and that actually during the course of your lease, you have a sustainability contact as a tenant that you can reach out to and talk to about your sustainability related initiatives. The other thing is that not every tenant is going to have a sustainability goal, right? So if you're going and telling people sustainability terms need to be within their lease, that's going to scare a lot of people off because maybe they've never thought about this. They're a smaller business. This seems like a lot of work. It seems like a lot of cost. So how do you engage those people? Well, you need a simpler program as well. So the other thing that is being seen around the world are simpler engagement models, which are focusing on things like a very small kind of low effort certification to get your tenants on board and give them some useful data. It might be maybe you give your tenants, you have an agreement with your tenants on providing energy data, you'll share the energy data, but then you provide them with a benchmark compared to the other people in the building so they can see actually whether they have opportunities to optimize their energy performance and reduce costs. So I think with the tenant engagement point, it's really important that we start to think about this as really a bit more nuanced than just providing a green lease and hoping people sign up. We need to really think about what types of tenants do we have, what are they struggling with, and how as a landlord can you actually meet your tenants' expectations there.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. And I think one of the interesting points you raised was on kind of certifications, and I guess it's a good chance for Yvonne to maybe weigh in on what you're seeing on this space.
Thank you, Tim. First of all, I would like to say a big thank you to NTU. This is like an oasis. I've been in Singapore 26 years. I'm from another NTU, National Taiwan University Business School as well. And wow, I never imagined a campus can look like this. And another secret is that I'm actually an intern referral to join Gradsby. So when my daughter was back in uni, she did an internship and I was in Capital Land at that time and wondering, how we can head towards a more green and sustainable buildings. And buildings do fascinate me because each building is like a person. We're all unique. Even identical twins are not identical. You look at KL, the Twin Towers, depending on how they receive the sunlight, maybe their solar panels will have different efficiency level. And they all have different stories, how they can go on retrofit journey. Or ASEAN, as we know, the next 1,000 babies will be born in Africa, India, and ASEAN. And they all need a place to live, work, learn, and play. And how can they live in greener buildings will determine how, as Prof. Simba said, viable humanity. And human civilization are built around water and ports, so we all have water issues and physical risks and so on. So how do we sort of incredible useful context and lay that back to the lens of green lease and green certification? In addition to commercial sector, investors love data centers and warehouses these days. And warehouses being, it's not hospital or hospitality that need to be 24/7 lights on. So when it comes to their UN PRI pledge, so if you think about the financial institution, GIC and MBIN, the sovereign wealth funds and many other pension funds, who manages our future, right? Our CPF and our future generations' future. They need to make sure that money continues to grow, but in terms of there's a Venn diagram crossover between values and valuations. Because while we want to be green, we also need our pension funds. So they are all looking at reducing their financial emission to net zero as well, and that puts pressure, hopefully, on the building sectors to perform. So they like warehouses, but they also like data centers, which I find green data centers an interesting concept. But the good news is, if you look at the sustainability maturity curve, there are very aggressive tenants out there, like the hyperscalers, the Amazons, and so on. They are actually the force of pushing data centers to be net zero, and a lot of them are morphed into renewable energy developers. So as Professor said, there's money to be made, right? With every crisis, there comes opportunities as well. In terms of green certification, the genesis of GRASP, for those who are not familiar, we were actually a university project in the Netherlands. So there were 3 pension funds in Europe, and Netherlands, small country like Singapore, they are not gonna have their own standards. They're gonna have international standards and play with everyone. So they might invest in, say, Germany, there's Passive House. In UK, there's BREEAM, in Singapore, there's BCA Green Mark. And how do you know whose building cert is light green and who is dark green? They need a translator, and GRASP was born. And so we went from 3 investors backing us to currently we're an investor-led organization with more than 150 institutional investors, and the collective AUM is over $50 trillion. So talking about using your wallet to vote, but it's not like they don't have their pressures as well, they do. So to give you an example of APG, they want to be net zero by 2040. And China's goal, for example, is carbon neutral 2060. But they say if the project is willing to come on board with them, they are still willing to invest. So I think, again, with a combination of policy and financial incentives, and with data transparency and harmonized green cert, we do have a shot at this. Sorry for hogging the mic, but I can talk to Councilman Homeland's buildings.
No, thanks. That's really good insight, Yvonne. And maybe I'll pass the mic now to CK and see, I know there's some nuances and sectorial differences, but maybe you can tease it out.
Yeah. So I think in terms of how Singapore has decarbonized since 2005, where green mark was first introduced by BCA. I think today, if you look at the progress we have made since 2005, we are actually achieving numerous buildings that are 80% more efficient than we were in 2005. So these are primarily the more learned owners and investors in the likes of CapitaLand, Keppel, who has really transformed the landscape in Singapore, whereby if you look at the central business district of Singapore, you look at all the grade A buildings like Capital Green, Capital Sky, the Keppel owned buildings, they are primarily all super low or green mark platinum. So we call them grade A buildings, whereby they are the prime estate. Okay? But there is also buildings that are so-called left behind, whereby they have failed to transform, and we call them grade B buildings or grade C buildings. Although there's no clear definition on why, how do we define grade B or grade C, but primarily these are buildings that doesn't have a very good large footprint, whereby you are not space efficient, you are dated in your facilities, and henceforth you are not able to get the grade A tenants that are able to pay you good rents. And there's a study done by Cushman & Wakefield and many other research institutes that green buildings actually command 10% premium in terms of rental. So this actually makes business sense for you to green your buildings. So anyway, we always say money talks. Okay, so money really talks to us in 3 ways. So in terms of how we measure whether a building asset is effective, is efficient, we actually look at the net property income, whereby the first way the money talks to you is that the net property income is making money, your P&L is good. And because you have good net property income, it gives you the ability to talk to a banker so that you can actually get liquidity, you can get leverage to borrow money to finance your green initiatives. Okay, so that's the second way that money talks to you. And the third way that money talks to you is that if you have a portfolio of building whereby your net property income is actually showing very good results, you attract equity, you attract investors. And this is primarily how the ecosystems will have a vicious cycle to continue to decarbonize in a very positive way. So my challenge is really with the grade B or grade C building owners that they are really, their building structure would give them a lot of challenges in terms of the financial aspect, the payback period. And they also don't enjoy the economies of scale like CapitaLand, whereby they have large footprint. So they are something like the middle class or the sandwich class of the asset owners, where they don't fit in the most ideal position. Yeah. So helping this group of asset owners decarbonize are the major challenge in this 15 years or 20 years of journey since Green Mark was introduced in 2005. And that's the last 30% of the buildings in Singapore. They are struggling to decarbonize. Yeah, maybe I stop here.
Thanks. I mean, I guess that's why there's collective sales and tear it down and rebuild. But maybe I'll pass the time now to maybe Sam to also kind of share the Hong Kong experience with this retrofitting the older buildings there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a huge issue. I fully echo TK's point. I think we also have an issue in general in Asia, particularly in sort of, high-rise, high-concentration cities, that land is at a real premium. So often it makes a lot more financial sense to knock down one of these old B and C buildings and build something new. We also don't build for a long time, right? A lot of buildings are built with an operating life of 30 to 50 years. So I think there's a huge issue regionally, actually, with this. I mean, when it comes to retrofits, I think actually at the moment, there's a need, I think, to just make it clear what the business case is for retrofit. What we're seeing a lot of clients starting to work on in Hong Kong now is mapping what we call a marginal abatement cost curve. And what this basically means is that you take a lot of data from various retrofits that have been done, and you can actually attach a cost per kilo of carbon abated, right? And you can actually kind of, spread that across the investment lifetime, factor in how long you actually, how long you've got left on your carbon target. And you can understand per kilo reduced, what is sort of the cheapest option. And so to me, that's what makes sense, right? Is that if you actually can start to generate transparency on these numbers for people, first of all, retrofit actually starts to make a lot more sense. Immediately, people think, when they think retrofit right now, about things like chiller upgrades. We've actually seen that in a lot of buildings in Hong Kong, chiller upgrades are now one of the most expensive things you can do, because everybody's been focusing on chiller upgrades. So they've all got really efficient chillers. So you can't get that transparency without the numbers. So I think that's something that to me is now super important, is that particularly real estate owners, landlords, now start actually developing these kind of curves. What this also really helps with, if you're the sustainability head, you can go to the CFO and you can speak their language to them, right? You can say, here is a map of exactly what it's going to cost. I can give you this many savings over the next 5 years, but from years 5 to 10, I'm going to need an investment from you, and they can start to plan that. So I think that would sort of be my recommendation if we're talking about retrofit, is let's start really attaching numbers to this stuff. The techniques to model it already exist. There's a huge amount of data in the market. It's just really about people sort of being aware of this and starting to do the calculations.
Yeah. Totally agree. So here I'm going to pivot and go somewhere interesting. I'm not sure they're prepared for it, but one of the recommendations was to expand innovative subsidies for green materials, passive buildings, and modular construction. So I'm going to go panelist by panelist and say, if you had carte blanche, where would you, or do you have an innovative subsidy that will move the needle that you think can be implemented?
I'll give you a stab. So coming back to ASEAN, because climate risk is like, we're all in this all together. We can't diversify from climate risk. And it's having the same set of rules. It's like Euro Cup football game, but we are playing at very different pitches. Maybe some of our neighbors in ASEAN are playing in mud pitches without shoes. And some of us are playing at Astro. So we can't really say whose experience can be applicable. However, there's not stopping us for applying by the same rule and take one step towards the right direction. And So I would say, we have retrofit experts here, so I will probably focus on the dual track effort. We also need to focus on the new build. And now we have a real chance. China steel industry seems to be really transforming. They produce 53% of steel. I know Swire Group in Shanghai actually imports steel from Turkey, so they can future-proof their embodied carbon, because they're foreseeing how financial sectors might reward them this way. So we are actually taking a group of Chinese delegation to visit Sweden. They have one of the most advanced net zero steel called H2 steel up in the Arctic Circle. So we want to suss out. So these hard to abate industry are really hard to move. So I think after we've done energy transition, which is the operational carbon, we will have to face the elephant in the room, which is steel and cement. The supply chain is complex and so on. So as that slide shows, we need your academia brain power, and we need a policy, we need the money, both from equity and bank side. So I think from subsidy point of view, currently there's already sustainability linked loans, green loans, but I think at the end of the day, someone will have to pay for the bill. We need more transition finance. The company won't be able to move by themselves just purely out of goodwill. And we are all in this together. And I think everyone needs to kind of dip into their pocket and then get their share at the right time to make this all work together. So
I'd maybe jump on that point, because I think it's what you say about reaching into the pocket is really key. I mean, I can again give some Hong Kong experience, but we in Hong Kong have now 10 of the largest property developers, all with a science-based target. Now, every single one of those will need to address low carbon materials if they want to have any hope of reaching short or long-term targets. The thing is that discussion hasn't really sort of hit the boardroom yet in a lot of cases, and so the financial impact of that hasn't really been felt. I think you're absolutely right. People need to reach into their pocket, and the leaders will have to, because it's really an economies of scale topic on materials. In terms of innovative materials, one other thing that I have seen recently, actually, which I think is really interesting, though, is book and claim models, where basically, if you are one of those who is reaching into your pocket to basically buy a lot of this material, or be one of the first to buy large volumes, you can actually create a certificate from that you can then sell to somebody else who's maybe in a different geography where the materials are not available yet, that they can actually attribute to their own decarbonization effort. I mean, there are these models basically where you can sort of share the cost impact, but I don't think those are going to be the fix. I don't think we should rely on those. It has to be really, if you have a science-based target, you need to realize that is a financial obligation, and it's something that you need to be prepared to, save money in some places, as we've said, with energy efficiency, but then you'll probably have to spend money in other places. But it is going to be short term, because once we achieve economies of scale on things like low carbon cement, the costs are going to come down because there won't be a market for high carbon cement anymore.
Yeah, I mean the strategy for a low carbon building is primarily very similar. You apply smart materials, green construction, passive, active strategies, overlay with smart controls and renewables. But I think right now, we as engineers, I think we need some help and incentive in terms of subsidies, in terms of grants, to be able to explore the frontier of how we cleverly integrate different technologies, different solutions together. So take, for example, in the net energy zero building for DBS. I think that was achieved in 2022, whereby a 35-year-old building in Singapore, four-story high, 55,000 square feet, we have managed to turn this 35-year-old building, brown building, into a net energy zero building, which means that it generates more renewable energy than it actually uses. So that as becomes a net energy, primarily this really show proof that existing buildings, if we cleverly put our engineering skills and lay them out nicely, so that technologies are not standalone, but integrated. So in the sense that There's no point buying the most efficient chiller if your pumps, your cooling towers, your fan coil units are not smartly controlled. Yeah. So don't spend money on buying the best equipment. Spend money on how you cleverly manage your equipment so that they perform well together as a system, not as individual equipment. So it's the same as engaging the tenants. There's no point having the best crafted plan if the stakeholders don't buy in. So that means that landlord, your tenants, your facility managers, your subcontractors, everybody must embrace the same vision of having a low carbon approach to your supply, your operation and maintenance. Yeah. So this is what we are advocating today. How do we create a more integrated and effective ecosystem?
Could I quickly jump in? So thank you, CK. Cushman is a very good partner of Grasby as well. You know, was a business student, still interested in CapEx. So as he said, it's really no point to go for the most expensive and fancy toy because it's, you know, at the end of the day, it has its payback period. So what I like about the green scorecard is that it's like your personalized health check. And once you go on this health check, it gives you a spider diagram and compare to 5 like for like. So it's a bit like, you know, there's no point of benchmarking my health checkup with a 20-year-old, so, you know, cardio and metabolism rate and so on. So we benchmark brown with brown, green with green, and see how they perform. And then you can see your average score of 5 other peers, how they are performing. So you are not investing too ahead of a time or falling behind. And also you can identify opportunities where there's the lowest hanging fruit and where it takes, you know, boardroom approval and much longer, and when is your CapEx injection. So it's a bit like a steering tool for you to make those decisions. Real estate is a very capital intensive industry. You need to understand your equity and debt financing. So having a tool like that really helps.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. I think now is a good time, I guess, when we talk about materials a little bit. You talked about green building, that maybe Prof. Tan can share with us his work on modular construction and 3D printing of cement and how it's a carbon capture solution.
Thanks, sir. I was wondering where I was going to come in.
Yeah, here you go.
I'm from just across the hill, Nanyang Hill, and School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. I actually am a metallurgist, but 10 years ago, I embarked on this journey on 3D construction printing. So it was a bit of a pie in the sky doing 3D printing construction. And I thought that it was an opportunity to change everything, revolutionize the energy equation, and actually build smarter, build safer, and build clever. So I got, as a typical academic, I had slides, half an hour talk, and I cut it down to by half. So I got about 10 slides here. So just introduce a few technologies here. Yeah, if you can look at the top 2 figures, they are the Fullerton building built in 1924 to 1928. Typical, lots of formwork, steel bars around. And then at the bottom, we have the construction of the Arc, which is on the other side of the hill in NTU. Hasn't changed. Lots of steel bars, a lot of workers on site, very dangerous circumstances, subject to rain and the heat, and actually a lot of fatalities. So during, I think 2017, there was a stop work order for 1 month because a worker died on site. So the stop work order. So things hasn't changed over 100 years. So there was a chance when we did 3D printing to revolutionize the way things are being done. So if you look at a car industry, you don't, I mean, from the Ford factory line to current factory lines, I've been to Renault, I've been to Nissan, no workers on the factory line, totally automated, hardly any. I went to the new Hyundai EV in Singapore. There was just a few workers just checking, making the machines and the robots are behaving themselves, but hardly one or two on the shop floor. So everything has been revolutionized in the industrial revolution, except the building and construction industry. So good reason there, construction, hardly any productivity over the last 50, 60 years, right? And the reason being, it's much cheaper to hire workers than to automate the industry, right? This is an article from The Economist. And because there are boom-bust cycles, so in a bust cycle, it's easier to retrench all the workers, send them back to home. So that's the business model for the industry. Likewise, much more different for the car manufacturing and even the agriculture industry, where a lot of science and digitalization has actually improved productivity. So if you look at the idea of 3D printing, which came about 20 years ago, it actually revolutionized manufacturing. You look at the designs, I shouldn't be pointing, but you look at the three designs, solid, short, and design for additive manufacturing, you spend less time, less weight, less material, and when you compare that to a bureau or agency, a lot cheaper if you do 3D printing. So that is the basis of 3D printing in construction. So for example, a bridge, the bridge actually consists a lot of members which are actually non-weight bearing. So if you remove all the non-weight bearing members, the weight of bridge can be very light. Likewise in other manufactured products. So for building and construction, this came from the World Economic Forum. The idea is to actually build less and build clever, right? Build less, there's a lot of growth cities in China, as you know, especially northern China. And the key takeaway there is that you have to look beyond making money. You need better planning, build clever. So the other project which I have been involved with is the Simba-Best project, actually in the NUS, the Create Labs, where they have come up with technologies whereby you use less air conditioning, less lighting when there's no one around. So for example, if you enter a building on a Saturday or Sunday, you don't switch on the lights for the whole building and air conditioning for the whole room. The light and the air conditioning follows you. And we've got sensors now to monitor this. It's like better use of energy rather than heating up the whole building or cooling up the whole building or lighting up the whole building. It follows you. So the technology is there. We can harness that to build smarter. So when we talk about net zero in buildings, we're not just talking about energy. We're talking about zero emissions, zero fatalities. A lot of injuries are happening on the work sites. So we're trying to eliminate errors. A good example is the Berlin airport, which was, if you follow the Berlin airport, I was there, they said it's going to be completed next year. And I think 5 years later, it was still being in construction, right? A lot of errors. I think there was like 10,000 building errors which needs to be corrected. And the cost overruns were like 2 or 3 times the original plan budget. So it's trying to build clever and trying to build smart and build with low energy. So what we did in 3D printing is we try to use waste material. We use fly ash residue from steel plants and actually use them as cement substitutes. So we finished a low-cost Indian toilet using fly ash as cement substitutes. So less cement, less carbon footprint. We also use recycled glass from water containers. So if you know, glass is actually SiO2, they can be sand substitutes. So we ground them the right size and we actually use them as 3D printed stools there at the bottom. Subsequently, we built a bathroom, okay, which is actually for high rise, where you can slot them in modularly. So this again is totally 3D printed in 9 hours, it says there. And the idea is that all the parts can be done modularly, because the toilet is the bathroom is the most complicated part of the building. There's sewerage, there's water, there's electrical, and it delays the completion. So the idea is to build them offsite and slot into the high rise. So these are some of our achievements. And the last one, which I want to mention, is concrete is very unusual that it actually can sequestrate carbon. So not only the CO2 can be sequestrated, it speeds up the hardening of the concrete, speeds up and actually hardens it by about 50% higher strength. So this one is a work in progress. We are hoping to have some press release on this. Actually, we managed to sequestrate more CO2 in 3D printed concrete than just normal cast concrete. So the idea is that if there's a carbon tax, there also could be carbon credits for buildings that sequestrate CO2. And we're talking about currently we've got about 2% of the weight of the building that we can sequestrate with CO2. So that can translate to a lot of money when you look at the amount of concrete that's being used in most buildings. So that's the last slide. And it's time for tea break. Thank you.
I don't know if it's time for a tea break yet, but that's a really amazing development. I don't know if you guys are, are aware of this, but I think it's really exciting. So now I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. Okay, so it's an open mic, or you can send your question to that QR code.
Hi, my name is Rahul. Very nice discussion, very good panel. I have a question about carbon pricing, and this was raised earlier as well. There was a beautiful map that came up, and there was some white areas and some blue areas, some red areas. So we obviously know that there is a carbon arbitrage that is happening. Some countries charge more, some countries charge less. And where I'm going with this is, like, when you talk about the sources of that carbon pollution that is there in the atmosphere, it's largely fossil fuel. And whether you buy 1 barrel of oil from North Korea or North Carolina, it's the same price. But when it comes to carbon pricing, we do not have a uniform price globally. So unless you have that, you will have this kind of arbitrage where companies will simply shift. It's like labor arbitrage. Companies will simply shift. So is there any consensus, or is anybody globally thinking about engaging bodies which can, market forces will not be able to do it, because every country will argue that, okay, my competitiveness comes down, so I don't want to do it by and large. So how can we deal with that? Because the planet is one.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can take that one. I think what we're seeing now around the world are what called border adjustment mechanisms. So you see, for example, in the EU, they've got something called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And basically what that means is that if you as an importer to the EU are bringing in a product from a country that has a lower carbon tax or a lower cost of carbon, however they charge it, you're forced to pay a top up at the import, right? So basically your effective price is the same as if you were buying that product in the EU. That's something that is affecting 6 industries so far. So it's concrete, steel, fertilizer, hydrogen, energy, and aluminium, I think. And that's something that is first of its kind around the world, but now there's, I think, 5 or 6 other jurisdictions that are putting in similar border adjustment mechanisms. So the UK is considering it. I think California is considering it, Australia, and maybe a few others. I think it remains to be seen how effective these are. With the EU one, there has been a lot of issues with rollout. Honestly, for people, for example, sourcing steel in China, it's almost impossible for them to get a number actually that they can really trust of what is really the footprint of that steel that they've bought. So there's a lot of questions still about actually how can we ensure the data is accurate? How can we actually really trace back where this is coming from? So I think there are efforts to do it. I think policy-wise, it's certainly seen as sort of a combination. I mean, some people are seeing it as protectionist, some people are seeing it as kind of a carbon measure. So I think it's still fairly controversial. But there are some efforts. I think in terms of just the actual kind of enforceability, there's a few things to iron out. But certainly we're seeing that globally now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really a problem. And you've already identified that every country has their own prerogatives. And I don't think there is a way they can get full consensus. I guess what we're trying to do, or with kind of the COPs in the Paris Agreement is everyone has to agree to a net zero. So I think an academic study done in Chicago once was that the correct price of carbon should be, I think, 280 or something, and no country is remotely close to what it needs to be. So I think if everyone kind of honors their goals, then somehow, some way it needs to get there. And I guess that's the only way to do it. I don't think anyone would hamper their own industry, or you can make a global body that will enforce a global carbon tax in the near future, at least. Time for one more question.
Thanks for the panel discussion. Actually, quite interesting topic always when we come to the decarbonization. But even in Singapore and nowadays we are talking more on the embodied carbon footprint of the building. But for the decarbonization in Singapore is very advanced. We work over the decades on the operational carbon reduction and become a mandatory already for the public buildings with greenhouse requirement. We have to be a super low energy building, must be a super low energy building. But why we are bit delay or we are not having any regulation on the embodied carbon yet in Singapore? But we have the calculator, but we talk quite a lot on the embodied carbon, and then already we have few timber building in Singapore. But in terms of the regulation or like a green mark, even there is the green mark is giving more important for the embodied carbon, the new one, but it's not mandatory yet. Is there any reason behind that why we are a bit delay in this to implement compared to the Nordics? They're very advanced, and then it's like for the building permit, they must submit the calculations. But here so far, no, just for the scoring only.
I see Yvonne is ready. Go, Yvonne.
I'll jump on this one. Yeah, indeed, Singapore has done an amazing job in operational carbon reduction with all our prop tech and sensors, and really way to go. When I was CapitaLand, there was a fish tank. We can literally see the entire portfolio. If a warehouse door is left open in Bangalore, we would know it in Singapore because the charts start beeping. But when it comes to embodied carbon, and you know, if Singapore were to reach our 2050 goal, retrofit and decarb is such an important pathway because we're a highly urbanized city. So very different story with India, lots of new build, and you could build them differently. So the problem with the hurdle is that Singapore steel could come from Japan, Korea, Turkey, China, and those are really hard to abate industry. It depends on that country's policy and intention to move that industry. And you know, there are only 2 provinces in China without steel factory. Basically, there's a massive overcapacity. They have more than 500 steel factories in China, produce 53% of world steel. So they're basically just waiting for each other to go belly up. And but at the present moment, there were some forward companies because the EV and so on, they build low carbon steel. And they just start announcing EPDs January this year. So as you mentioned, the data transparency, you have to have bankable data that you can trust to start with. So I would give a really kind of irresponsible answer. It's kind of out of our hand, right? Like in a way, yes, Singapore does have intention to do good, but we also need to face the reality that it's quite a big fish to fry, and it takes more stakeholders. You basically need all hands on deck. You need the policy, private capital, people activism, philanthropic capital, and trying to move this. It needs a game changer, and for cement industry as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks for your answer. But my question is, I mean, to set the benchmark, maybe yes, we need to wait for the industry to balance. For the EPDs and all this, but to mandatory to give the the industry or the consumer must submit that embodied carbon calculations. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't want to set the benchmark. I mean, I know we are not ready in Asia yet. But at least we have the calculator already for the embodied carbon, SDBC. And also we have the carbon calculator for the MEP system. Even in Europe, it's very basic for the calculation of the MEP system is not that level yet. But Singapore is very advanced. We already have the calculator.
So,
but it's not made mandatory yet.
So I think that's a interesting and fair question. I don't think it's above any of our pay grades here to decide government policy or law. I think that I think it's probably in the works. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking out of turn here, but if you look at Singapore's legislative history, we do kind of study what other countries do, where people mess up, where people have done well, and we come up with our own law. So, for example, we look at the plastic bag charge. Only very recently have we made it kind of into law to charge for that 5 cents. It's not that Singapore doesn't care, but they've done. I mean, when I spoke to the policymakers then, they said, look, we have done the scientific study. Literally, it does not make a difference in Singapore whether we charge at 5 cents or not charge at 5 cents. The only reason we made the charge is because we want to send an educational policy shift to say that this is what we need to do to reduce waste. But from a practical perspective, it did nothing for Singapore from that kind of decarbonization perspective. So that's kind of why they did that. But to answer your question as to whether it will be made mandatory, I do foresee that it will be at some point in time, but they probably need to calibrate it to make sure that they get it right. And that's kind of Singapore for you. They want to make sure they get it right. All right, thank you. I think my time is up. So if you put your hands together and thank my wonderful panelists.
Thank you for that very insightful panel discussion.